Welcome to this mini lecture on self-assessments and 360 feedback. Over the course of the next several minutes, I'm going to describe the self-assessment tool and identify some key questions and considerations that you can use as a leader when using this tool. In addition, I'm also going to talk about the 360-degree feedback tool and how it can be used in your organization and some suggestions on how to use it more effectively. Many times in organizations, the performance review process is one-sided, where the manager writes a review based upon their recollection of the employee's performance. Among other things, this leaves a lot of potential feedback behind, and as leaders, we don't always see everything that employees do, so we could benefit from more than one perspective on an employee's performance. Sometimes someone else might see something that we've missed or maybe not considered. So a couple of tools to help overcome this are the self-assessment as well as 360-degree feedback. Self-assessments are quite simply asking the employee to rate their own performance. This is a great way to get employees involved in the process and to gain some additional perspective on the employee's performance. If you think about yourself, does your manager really see everything that you do? Are there wins or challenges that you've experienced that you'd like your manager to know about so that you can receive credit for it? We all do, and the self-assessments provide employees with the opportunity to do just that. So, even without a standard process in your organization, and many organizations don't have a standard process for self-assessments, you can still give your employees some questions to think about for your discussion during the review process. It's important to ask them to be very specific in their responses, so rather than answering in vague questions, ask them to quantify their answers by providing facts and figures. So for instance, instead of an employee saying, I increased my productivity over the last year, have them say something like, I increased my productivity over the last year by 25% by doing these three things. So ask them to be as specific as possible. And just some questions that you can ask them to consider within this process are, what accomplishments are you most proud of this year? What do you like best about your job, and what do you like least about your job? What would you change about your job? What goals are you thinking about for the coming year? What do you see as your greatest strengths in your position? And what job skills do you think that you need to work on? As a leader, it's important that you use self-assessments as just one source of information. So you want to be sure that you're also using your own feedback, metrics, 360 feedback if possible. In addition to this, and just as important, is that we be sure that we actually use the information provided by the employees. Think about how demotivating it would be if you asked the employee to go through this process of getting their feedback and then none of it was actually used in the review process. So it's important that we actually use the information that's provided. But we also don't want to use the information as just the only source, so taking the employee feedback and writing the review based on that. It's really just one of multiple sources that we can use in terms of writing the performance review. And one thing that you really want to think about is start writing a draft of the review before you review these other sources. So that way, your view and your perspective isn't biased by other people's views. So you can start writing a review or start drafting it just based on your own feedback and then incorporate these other pieces. Also, you want to consider what should be in the review and what shouldn't. So obviously it's important that we use the employees' self-assessment information, but there may be pieces that we don't want to include in the review itself. So as you're reviewing the information that the employee provides, you want to be sure that you take a look at which pieces should be written into the review and maybe which pieces should be pulled out and talked about during the review process or when you're sitting down having that discussion with the employee. So just because the employee provides it doesn't mean you have to use it and write it in the review. You could pull some pieces out and use them separately as well. 360-degree feedback is the process of seeking feedback from those that the employee has worked with. This is really a collaborative process, and you should sit down and meet with the employee to determine who that feedback should be coming from. You want to be sure that these people are those that the employee has had a meaningful relationship with over that review period and can answer the questions that you pose to them in an objective and an accurate way. This should really be a variety of people, and we want to make sure that we don't use the employee's best friend at work or somebody that the employee really doesn't get along with at work, because they're not going to be able to provide objective and accurate feedback. But we want to make sure that these are people that they work with over the normal course of business, people that they've worked on a project with. We want to avoid it from being 3 people that were involved in the same project, but maybe 1 person from multiple projects. So that way we have that variety in there. You should also consider whether this 360 feedback is going to be anonymous or if those respondents will be identified in the feedback, because that's important for the respondents to determine if they feel comfortable providing the information, but also it's going to influence their responses as well. And 360 feedback doesn't need to be complex, and really it's quite simple. It's just a process of asking open-ended questions and then allowing those people to provide information for you. So it doesn't have to be a very difficult or rigorous process. And here are just 4 simple questions that you can ask those respondents to provide. You could ask them just simply, what do you depend on this employee for? So what's your relationship with them? What role have they filled for you in the past? Are there projects that they've worked on with you? And what role, obviously, did they fill along the way? How well did he or she meet that need for you? So whatever you depend on them for, how well did they do that? What are the strengths that you see this employee display, as well as what do you think this employee could do differently that would help you do your job? So again, these are very open-ended questions that provide the opportunity for the respondents to answer in a way that they're comfortable and provide the amount of detail that they're comfortable providing and that they're able to provide based upon their relationship with the employee. Now, as a leader, you want to be sure, just like with self-assessments, that you're using this alongside other sources of data. So you want to make sure that you're using the self-assessment, that you're using your own information, if you have metrics within the organization, that you're pulling all of these pieces together in order to write the performance review. You also want to let those respondents know ahead of time if their feedback is going to be confidential or not. So again, that way they can determine if they feel comfortable responding, and also so that their expectations are met and they understand what that information is going to be used for and how. When you actually write the review, you want to make sure that you're not quoting the respondents directly based on the information that they've provided for you. Instead, maybe you want to paraphrase it or incorporate it into something larger in terms of how you're writing the review, but you really don't want to quote those respondents. Again, especially if you are providing confidential information, then if you're just quoting somebody, then it's a lot easier for the employee to know who provided that information to you. And then also, you want to make sure that you're looking for patterns and patterns from your feedback. You don't want to look at the extremes. You don't want to just take out the extremely good or the extremely bad feedback and incorporate that. You want to see what the pattern is, and that's really what you want to use. That pattern may be extremely good or it may be extremely bad, but we stay away from pulling outliers into the review. And maybe those are things that maybe we can call out during the discussion of the review, but not incorporate in the review itself, indicative of their performance. So as a leader, as always, we want to be reflective, and we want to think about how does this topic impact us as a leader. And what I'd like you to think about is, what can you do as a leader to use self-assessments and 360 feedback in your review process? If you already have these tools within your toolkit as a leader, how do you use them more effectively and make sure that you're using them faithfully? And then also, if you don't, how can you either work with your human resources department to get them in place, or how can you use these in a more of an informal way as part of your review process? And then also think about, how do you use them maybe even beyond the review process? So rather than just soliciting this feedback once a year, how do you use 360 feedback throughout the course of the year? So when an employee completes a project, send 360 feedback out to some of those participants, and that way you're not just using it to write reviews, but also as a coaching tool. So that way the employee has the opportunity to change and adapt over the course of the year. So just a few things to think about in terms of how you can use these tools to be a more effective leader in your organization. So I hope that you found this mini lecture helpful and beneficial for you as a leader. You can stay connected to Bishop House online at www.bishophouse.com. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag LeadWell. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.